As the weather continues to warm up and the boating season continues to get more active around the world, more and more boats are hitting the water. Though some of them may be a little less successfully than others,
What happened?
but at least we can still get out on the water. And with all of these boats hitting the water, we're starting to talk about the concept of how to leave your engine again, which is a pretty simple concept to many long-term boaters, but for some newer boaters, it's a great question. The answer is also great, with some things that even the long-term boaters might not have thought about when it comes to doing what we do and why we do it when it comes to how we leave the engine on the boat. We'll break this down into two categories to begin with. The first being when we leave the boat in the water, and the second being when we leave the boat out of the water. Then on top of that, we're going to add in the factor of time and how long the boat will be left like this. Let's actually start with leaving the boat out of the water first, because this has a couple of different considerations that need to be taken into account. The number one consideration for either situation in or out of the water as well is going to be your location. You know, that's kind of like the standard measuring stick when it comes to boating considerations, the location and the environment. It's like the foundational question that can determine multiple outcomes because of how harsh the environment and weather can be on the boat and engine based on where you are at. But when it comes to leaving the boat out of the water, we generally want to leave the engine in the fully down or tucked position. Boaters that have to deal with freezing conditions are pretty used to this concept, because they have to leave the engine tucked to allow all the water to drain out of the engine, because if they left the engine up and the engine held all that water in the cooling passages and other areas, then the water would freeze, causing all kinds of unwanted damage.
No one said anything about cold.
Though when you don't have to deal with freezing conditions, you still want to leave the engine tucked in the full down position for a different reason, being that you want to protect the seals of the trim system as much as possible. When the engine is trimmed up, this exposes those rubber seals a lot more than when the engine is tucked down. And you know, when you leave rubber outside and in the sun, that rubber heats up and cools down a lot more often, which quickens up the process of dry rot, which in turn creates a leak in the trim system, causing even more issues. Another reason is the trim rams themselves. Tucking them all the way in retracts the polished rams into the unit where they stay soaked in hydraulic trim fluid, keeping them from the elements where pitting and scratching can occur. That then turns into expensive replacements and repairs to the trim system. But we'll go a step above that even and talk about the difference between keeping the boat on a lift versus the boat on a trailer, because this introduces a completely different issue into the mix, being whether the engine gets trimmed up at all or not. Whenever we trailer a boat, the engine gets trimmed up and then taken wherever it is that we are going. Then whenever we get there, you can trim the engine down and flush it out, clean the boat, all that good stuff. But whenever you have the boat on a lift, you might not even think about trimming the engines because you want to keep them in the down position anyway, which is all fine and good, but something that happens if we don't trim the engine at all is that after running the engine, there is oil left behind in all of the oil passages on a 4-stroke engine, in the crankshaft area, in the heads, and all throughout the engine. If we don't trim the engine at all, then this oil will then be sitting in these passages, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does give us a result that we don't normally consider, being that this oil left throughout the engine has one location that will result in quicker oil consumption. With the engine trimmed all the way down, the cylinders of the engine are left on a horizontal plane, normally with a little negative trim to them, making the cylinders have a downward slope to them towards the head. When oil gets left behind the pistons inside of the cylinders, the oil will drain past the piston rings and into the actual cylinder of the engine, where when we start the engine up, the oil will get consumed by the engine, which then burns that little bit of oil every startup after leaving the boat. This is why you can also notice a pretty smoky startup sometimes, even with a 4-stroke. Over so many startups and runtime, you will be losing oil in the engine, making it that much more important to check your engine oil and service the engine every 100 hours of use. So to lessen this from happening when keeping the boat on a lift, all you need to do is just trim the engines up a little bit while you're cleaning the boat. Then after 15 to 20 minutes, go ahead and trim them back down to protect all the trim system and not have this oil deal to think about. That 15 to 20 minutes with some trim in the engine allows all of the oil to drain out of the engine and down into the oil pan, which is exactly what is happening when we trailer the boat and have the trim in the engine before we get to wherever we are going. Now, if we are going to be using the boat the next day or so, then it really doesn't matter as much. You can trim the engine up to let all the oil drain into the pan, but for 1 or 2 nights on the trailer, it really doesn't matter if you want to just leave the engine up to make it easier. This isn't going to make much of a difference when we are talking about a day or two. But moving over to keeping the boat in the water, this is an entirely different issue altogether. Mainly because we really don't have a choice in the matter. You're going to want to keep the engine trimmed up, out of the water, simply because you don't want the lower unit and the bottom of the midsection just sitting in the water, getting growth to build up on it. Leaving it down for one night isn't going to allow much growth, but in certain climates, especially down here, leaving the engine in the water for even a couple of nights can allow algae and growth to develop on the lower unit, which will eventually start to eat away at the lower unit, the paint, and even the casing and the propeller and all other metals of the lower unit and the bolts holding it onto the engine. This is why the outboards have become so dominant in the boating market, a lot being this simple feature letting us trim the engine out of the water, where the stern drives, IOs, and straight drives, we never had this ability, and we had to deal with all of the issues of corrosion and other damaging effects that can be left on the outdrive due to the water. So let us know which one of these affects you. Do you trailer, keep your boat on a lift, or leave it in the water so it's always ready to go? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to visit us at bornagainboating.com, where you can sign up for the community and join many other boaters on different boating topics. And make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Thank you all for hanging out with us this week, and we look forward to seeing you next week.